It is the morning after Christmas. The house is enormous. 6,500 square feet of hallways, staircases, and rooms that fold into other rooms. Officers move through it carefully, methodically. They check the living room, the kitchen, the upper bedrooms, every closet, every corner, every space a person could reasonably be hiding in, or hidden. They descend to the basement. They walk through the train room, the furnace room, a narrow, high-low-ceilinged corridor that leads deeper into the dark. And then, a door. An officer stops, studies the latch for a moment, thinks it through, decides there is nothing behind it that warrants opening, decides the latch alone is reason enough to move on. He turns around. He walks back up the stairs. For the next 7 hours, no one goes back down there. No one opens that door. No one looks inside that room. They searched the entire house that morning, top to bottom, room by room. There was one place they never looked. Before diving in, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to stay updated on our latest cold case stories. Drop a comment and tell us where you are watching from right now. Boulder, Colorado, does not look like a place where something like this could happen. That is, in many ways, the point. Nestled at the eastern edge of the Rocky Mountain foothills, Boulder in 1996 was a prosperous, quietly self-satisfied university town of roughly 90,000 people. It had the University of Colorado. It had farmers markets and craft breweries before those things were fashionable anywhere else. It had a citizenry that prided itself on being educated, progressive, and above all, safe. The violent crime rate was negligible. Murders were rare enough that when they did occur, they were treated as aberrations. Accidents of fate that belonged to Denver, to Chicago, to cities with harder edges, not here, not in Boulder. That confidence, that deep civic certainty that violence was something that happened somewhere else, would be shattered before the new year arrived. 755 and 15th Street sat in one of Boulder's most desirable neighborhoods, a 6,500 square foot colonial revival home that spoke to a very particular kind of American success. Tall white columns, a wraparound porch, a grand curved staircase visible through the front windows. It was the kind of home that communicated permanence, ambition fulfilled, and a life well constructed. JonBenét Ramsey had constructed that life deliberately and impressively. John was the CEO of Access Graphics, a computer hardware distribution company headquartered right there in Boulder, operating under the umbrella of Lockheed Martin. In December of 1996, Access Graphics had just crossed $1 billion in annual revenue. John's Christmas bonus that year was $118,000, a number that seemed, at the time, like nothing more than a reward for hard work and good business. Within days, that specific figure would become one of the most chilling details in the entire investigation. He was, by every outward measure, at the pinnacle of his life. Respected in business, known at his church, admired by his employees, the kind of man other men in Boulder quietly aspired to be. His wife, Patricia, Patsy, was the emotional engine of the family, and by nearly all accounts one of the most genuinely warm people in their social circle. Patsy had been born and raised in Parkersburg, West Virginia, and crowned Miss West Virginia in 1977. She brought a southern graciousness to Boulder that people still speak about with real affection. She was theatrical, creative, and extraordinarily devoted to the people she loved. She threw holiday gatherings that friends remember to this day in vivid detail, the hand-painted decorations, the immaculate table settings, the warmth that radiated from every corner of that house the moment you stepped inside. She was the kind of woman who made you feel, within minutes of meeting her, that she had been hoping specifically to see you. She had also, in 1993, been diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer. She had fought it aggressively and, by 1996, was in remission. Those who knew her said the experience had made her, if anything, more intensely present as a mother, more deliberate, more grateful for every ordinary moment. She adored her children with a ferocity that was impossible to miss. Burke Ramsey was 9. JonBenét was 6. JonBenét Patricia Ramsey was born on August 6, 1990. and she was, by the accounts of teachers, family friends, neighbors, and virtually everyone who encountered her, a child of remarkable, effervescent spirit. Small for her age, gap-toothed, blonde hair that her mother loved to style. She was curious and chatty and had an almost instinctive gift for connection. The kind of child who walked up to strangers at birthday parties and within 2 minutes had them laughing. Her first-grade teacher described her as deeply empathetic, the first in the classroom to notice when another child was upset, the one who would quietly move her chair closer to sit beside someone who was sad. Yes, Patsy had entered her in child beauty pageants, and yes, JonBenét had won titles, including Little Miss Colorado and Colorado State All-Star Kids Cover Girl. That contrast is important. The pageant image is the one the world received. The home video is the one her family lived with. And the gap between those two pictures is in many ways the gap between what this case actually was and what the media turned it into. She wanted to be a doctor when she grew up. She had asked Santa for a bicycle that Christmas. She was missing her 2 front teeth and still carried a stuffed rabbit she had named Raggedy. On the night of December 25, 1996, after a Christmas day that everyone who was there describes as warm, happy, and completely ordinary, JonBenét Ramsey went to sleep in her bed. Her mother kissed her forehead in the dark, stood for a moment in the doorway, looked at her sleeping daughter one last time, thought how peaceful she looked, and then closed the door. By morning, that peace would be gone, and Boulder, Colorado, would wake up to discover that the thing it had always feared most had not come from the outside at all. It had been right there, inside the house, all along. Patsy Ramsey came downstairs at approximately 5:45 a.m. on December 26, 1996. She had not yet changed from the night before, still wearing the same red turtleneck and black pants she had worn to the Whites' Christmas dinner. She was heading to the kitchen, making her way down the spiral staircase toward the main level of the house. It was an ordinary morning movement in an ordinary house. She was not alarmed. She was not expecting anything. And then she saw it. Spread across the steps near the base of the staircase was a handwritten note, 2.5 pages long, written on lined paper torn from a notepad that sat on a writing desk just a few feet from where the note was found. Patsy stopped. She picked it up. She began to read. The note opened with the words, "Mr. and Mrs. I, listen carefully." It claimed to be from a small foreign faction. It said JonBenét had been kidnapped. It demanded a ransom of $118,000. And here is where the first wave of dread sets in, because $118,000 was not a round number. It was not a figure plucked from the air. It was, almost to the dollar, the exact amount of John Ramsey's Christmas bonus from Lockheed Martin that year, a figure known to almost no one outside of that household. The note warned that if the Ramseys contacted police, the FBI, or anyone else, JonBenét would be beheaded. It said the kidnappers would call the following morning between 8 a.m. and 10 a.m. with further instructions for the ransom drop. It was specific, it was detailed, and it was written in a hand that detectives would later spend years trying to match to a suspect. Patsy dropped the note and ran upstairs to JonBenét's room. The bed was empty. She screamed for John. He came running. They checked Burke's room. He was asleep. They ran through the upper floors calling JonBenét's name. Nothing. No answer, no sound. Just the pre-dawn silence of a house that suddenly felt completely different from the one they had gone to sleep in. Patsy called 911 at 5:52 a.m. The call lasted approximately 4 minutes. Patsy's voice is audible on the recording, high, fractured, barely holding together. She told the dispatcher her daughter had been kidnapped. She gave the address. She said there was a ransom note. The dispatcher instructed her to stay on the line, but the call disconnected. It was later discovered that in the final seconds of the recording, before the line cut, voices could be heard in the background, voices that investigators would spend considerable time analyzing. What was said and by whom has never been conclusively resolved. Officers Rick French and Barry Weiss arrived at the home within 4 minutes of the call. And this is where the investigation begins to fracture, quietly, almost invisibly, but irreparably. The Boulder Police Department's protocol for a reported kidnapping was clear. Isolate the scene, restrict access, separate all occupants immediately, and treat the residence as a potential crime scene until proven otherwise. That protocol existed for a reason. Evidence is fragile. Contamination happens fast. The first 30 minutes at a scene can determine whether a case is ever solved. None of that protocol was followed. Patsy, in the minutes before police arrived, had done the entirely human thing. She had called her friends, the Whites, the Fernies, her pastor, Raul Hoverstock. By the time the sun came up over Boulder on December 26th, the Ramsey home had been filled with as many as a dozen civilians, most of them moving freely through what should have been a sealed and sterile crime scene. Friends embraced Patsy in the kitchen. Someone made coffee. Countertops were wiped, and surfaces were touched. Items were moved without anyone keeping any record of what had been where. The victims' advocates who arrived that morning were doing exactly their job, supporting a family in crisis. But in doing that job inside an unsecured crime scene, they were quietly and unknowingly dismantling the evidentiary foundation that any prosecution would later need to stand on. Detective Linda Arndt arrived at 8:10 a.m. For much of that morning, she was the only detective present in that house. One detective. One case. One of the most complex potential crime scenes in Colorado history. She has spoken publicly about the impossibility of what she was managing alone. A house full of grieving civilians, a missing child, an active ransom note, and the ticking clock of the kidnapper's supposed 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. call window. The call never came. 8 a.m. passed, then 9, then 10. The phone stayed silent. And, as the window the ransom note had specified closed without contact, the working theory of an active kidnapping, the theory that had shaped every decision made that morning, began to quietly collapse. At around 1 p.m., Detective Arndt made a decision that has been debated ever since. With the kidnapping theory unraveling and the crime scene already badly compromised, she asked John Ramsey and his friend Fleet White to conduct a search of the house, to look for anything unusual, like anything out of place. A reasonable instruction in theory, catastrophic in execution. John Ramsey went to the basement. He moved through the train room, past the furnace, down the narrow corridor. And he stopped at the door, the same door Officer French had examined that morning and walked away from. The door with the wooden latch. The door no officer had opened. John Ramsey opened it. Inside the wine cellar, a small windowless room used primarily for storage, he found his daughter. JonBenét was lying on the stone floor. Her wrists were bound above her head with a white cord. Her mouth was covered with black duct tape. There was a cord wound tightly around her neck, a makeshift garrote fashioned from the handle of a broken paintbrush found in Patsy's art supply kit, located elsewhere in the basement. A white blanket had been placed over her body. John Ramsey screamed. He tore the tape from her mouth. He picked her up and carried her upstairs, destroying, in that single act of desperate paternal love, whatever forensic evidence the positioning of her body might have preserved. JonBenét Patricia Ramsey was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner would later determine that she had been struck on the head with sufficient force to cause a skull fracture, and that she had been strangled. The blow to the head came first. The strangulation came after. She had also been sexually assaulted. She had been dead for hours before anyone found her. She had been in that basement, 8 steps below the main floor of the house where her parents were awake and waiting for a phone call, for the entire morning. And the door to the room where she lay had been standing right there, closed, latched, unopened, for 7 hours and 5 minutes. By the afternoon of December 26, 1996, the Ramsey home at 755 15th Street had been transformed from a potential kidnapping scene into a confirmed murder scene. And already, within hours of JonBenét's body being discovered, the investigation was in serious trouble. The crime scene had been compromised beyond recovery. Dozens of civilians had moved through the house that morning. Surfaces had been touched. The body had been moved by the victim's own father before investigators could document its original position. And now, detectives were attempting to reconstruct an evidentiary picture from a canvas that had already been smudged, stepped on, and partially erased. But what they did find, in the hours and days that followed, was deeply disturbing and deeply complicated. The ransom note alone was extraordinary. At 2.5 pages, it was one of the longest ransom notes in the recorded history of American crime. Handwriting analysts were brought in immediately. The notepad it had been written on was recovered from the desk near the staircase, and crucially, investigators found a practice note on the pad. Someone had started writing the ransom note, stopped, discarded the page, and started again. That meant whoever wrote it had composed this note inside the house. Not beforehand, not at a separate location. They had sat down in the Ramsey home with the Ramsey notepad and written it there. That single detail pointed in one overwhelming direction. Investigators requested handwriting samples from both John and Patsy Ramsey almost immediately. Patsy's samples drew particular scrutiny. Multiple handwriting analysts examined her writing against the note over the years that followed, and their conclusions ranged from inconclusive to suggestive but not definitive. No analyst ever conclusively matched the ransom note to Patsy's handwriting, but no analyst ever definitively excluded her either. The note remained one of the most analyzed and most debated documents in American forensic history. The garrote around JonBenét's neck told its own grim story. It had been fashioned from white cord and the broken handle of a paintbrush identified as belonging to a set in Patsy Ramsey's personal art supply kit, stored in a basement room not far from the wine cellar. The cord used in both the garrote and the binding of JonBenét's wrists was never conclusively sourced. Investigators could not definitively establish where it had come from, or whether it had been brought into the house by an intruder or sourced from within. The sexual assault evidence was perhaps the most significant and the most contested. JonBenét had been sexually assaulted. The medical examiner found evidence of both acute and chronic injury, a finding that sparked an enormous and deeply painful public debate about whether the abuse had been ongoing, and if so, by whom. Later re-examination of the forensic evidence led many experts to walk back the chronic injury conclusion, attributing some of the physical findings to other causes. But the acute assault, occurring at or around the time of death, was not in dispute. And beneath JonBenét's fingernails and on the waistband of her underwear, investigators found something that would ultimately become the most important piece of evidence in the entire case: DNA. A small but detectable sample of male DNA belonging to an unknown individual was recovered from JonBenét's clothing. In 1996, DNA technology was not sophisticated enough to do much with a sample that small. It was documented, preserved, and largely set aside. It would wait for years, for decades, patient and silent in a forensic evidence locker while the investigation churned through suspects, theories, and public accusations above it. That DNA would eventually change everything. But in the weeks and months immediately following JonBenét's murder, the investigation was consumed not by science, but by suspicion. If you're still watching, you're exactly who this channel is for. Real quick, drop a comment and tell me what's the weather like where you are right now. I'm always curious where you're tuning in from. And if this story is getting to you, hit that like and share button. It helps more people find these untold cases. The Ramseys had lawyered up quickly. Within days of their daughter's murder, both John and Patsy retained criminal defense attorneys, a move that, to the Boulder Police Department, read as consciousness of guilt. To their attorneys, it was standard and sensible advice for any family in that position. That tension, between the Ramseys' legal caution and the police department's interpretation of it, would poison the relationship between investigators and the family for years. The Ramseys did not submit to formal police interviews until April of 1997, 4 months after JonBenét's murder. The Boulder Police Department, already under enormous public pressure to make an arrest, found this delay infuriating. Investigators were convinced, or had convinced themselves, that the answer to this case was inside that house, that it was one of the parents, possibly both. And so the investigation narrowed. Tunnel vision in criminal investigation is not a dramatic, conscious decision. It does not arrive with a declaration or a moment of choice. It creeps in, quietly, incrementally, Each time a detective interprets an ambiguous piece of evidence in the direction they are already leaning. And each time a lead pointing elsewhere receives a fraction of the resources that the preferred theory receives. In the JonBenét Ramsey case, that tunnel vision calcified around John and Patsy Ramsey within the first weeks of the investigation. And once it set, it was nearly impossible to dislodge. Other leads did exist. They were substantial. And for years they were systematically underweighted. There was a known sex offender who lived within walking distance of the Ramsey home. He had a documented history of targeting young girls in Boulder and had not been rigorously accounted for on the night of December 25th. There were at least 2 other individuals in the Ramseys' broader social circle who exhibited behaviors that, in retrospect, warranted far deeper scrutiny than they received. There were reports of a vehicle seen parked near the house on Christmas night that was never traced. There was evidence of a possible point of entry. A broken basement window with a scuff mark on the sill and a suitcase positioned beneath it on the inside that could have indicated how an intruder entered the home. Boulder Police examined these leads, but they examined them the way you examine something you have already decided does not matter. The evidence from the broken window became a particular point of contention. John Ramsey said he had broken the window himself months earlier and had never gotten around to fixing it. Investigators took this as further evidence of his involvement, but no one conclusively proved it could not have been used as an entry point on the night of the murder, and no one produced evidence that it definitively had been used either. The case lived in that ambiguity. It still does. The autopsy findings deepened the complexity. JonBenét had died from asphyxiation due to strangulation. The skull fracture, a severe 8.5-inch crack to the right side of her head, had been caused by a blow with a hard, smooth object. The fracture was significant enough to have caused rapid incapacitation, possibly immediately. Investigators believed the blow came first, rendering JonBenét unconscious or near unconscious, and that the garrote was applied afterward. The medical examiner classified the manner of death as homicide. The time of death was estimated at between 10 p.m. on December 25th and 6 a.m. on December 26th, a window that encompassed the entire night. Meaning she could have been killed shortly after the Ramseys returned home from the Whites' dinner, or she could have been killed in the early hours of the morning. That window refused to close, and without a precise time of death, the timeline could not be locked. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit was consulted. Their profilers noted several elements of the crime that were consistent with someone who had intimate knowledge of the home, the use of materials sourced from inside the house, the specificity of the ransom amount, the complexity of the note. But profiling is not evidence. It is inference built on pattern. And in this case, the patterns pointed in multiple directions simultaneously, allowing both sides of the debate, intruder versus family member, to cherry-pick the elements that suited their theory. The public, meanwhile, had already made up its mind. The media coverage of the JonBenét Ramsey case was, even by the standards of tabloid true crime journalism, extraordinary in its scale and its recklessness. The pageant photographs were everywhere. Patsy Ramsey's grief was dissected on cable news. Former investigators gave interviews. Unnamed sources fed speculation to newspapers. Legal analysts debated guilt on evening programs without any of the evidence that would have been required to establish it in a courtroom. The court of public opinion convicted Patsy Ramsey swiftly and with enormous confidence. She was painted as a stage mother who had pushed her daughter too hard, who was controlling and performative, whose grief seemed somehow theatrical. Too much, or not enough, depending on which broadcast you were watching. The cruelty of that coverage, directed at a woman who had lost her 6-year-old child and was simultaneously the prime suspect in her death, is difficult to fully reckon with even now. John Ramsey was treated with somewhat more restraint, the composed businessman projecting less of a target than his emotionally expressive wife. But he was not spared, neither of them was. In 1998, Boulder County District Attorney Alex Hunter convened a grand jury to examine the evidence. The grand jury sat for 13 months, the longest grand jury proceeding in Colorado history at that point. In October of 1999, the jurors voted to indict both John and Patsy Ramsey on charges of child abuse resulting in death and being accessories to a crime. District Attorney Hunter reviewed their findings and made a decision that stunned the city. He declined to sign the indictment. He concluded there was insufficient evidence to secure a conviction. The indictments were sealed, filed away, and not made public. They would not become public knowledge for another 13 years. The investigation stalled. The leads went cold. The Ramseys relocated to Atlanta. Patsy Ramsey's cancer returned. She died on June 24, 2006, 10 years after her daughter's murder, never having been charged, never having been cleared, and never having seen justice served. She died under a cloud that never lifted, and in a forensic evidence locker in Boulder, Colorado, where that small sample of unidentified male DNA continued to wait, sitting in silence, belonging to someone whose name investigators did not yet know, someone whose profile did not match any member of the Ramsey family, someone who, according to the science, had been in contact with JonBenét Ramsey at or around the time of her death. The case was not closed, it was not solved. It was simply frozen, suspended in the terrible in-between space that cold cases occupy, where the truth is present somewhere in the evidence but the means to reach it has not yet arrived. That means was coming. It was just going to take time. Let's slow down here. Because what happens next in this story does not arrive with the crash and noise of a dramatic arrest. It does not come with flashing lights or a courtroom moment or a headline that breaks cleanly across a single morning. What happens next arrives quietly, in a laboratory, under a microscope, through a technology that did not exist in any meaningful form when JonBenét Ramsey was murdered. It arrives the way truth often does in cold cases, slowly, incrementally, and at a cost that can never fully be calculated. By the mid-2000s, forensic DNA technology had advanced in ways that investigators working the case in 1996 could not have anticipated. The original DNA sample recovered from JonBenét's clothing had been collected using the best methods available at the time. But the sample was small, degraded, and limited in what it could yield under 1990s laboratory conditions. It told investigators that the DNA belonged to an unidentified male. It told them it did not match John Ramsey. It told them it did not match Burke Ramsey. And it sat there, in that evidence locker, waiting for science to catch up. In 2008, it did. The Boulder District Attorney's Office, now under the leadership of Mary Lacey, authorized the use of a then-emerging technique called touch DNA analysis. Unlike traditional DNA testing, which required a visible biological sample, blood, saliva, tissue, touch DNA could extract a genetic profile from the microscopic skin cells left behind simply by touching a surface. A handshake, a shoulder, the waistband of a pair of underwear. Investigators submitted JonBenét's clothing for reanalysis under this new methodology. What came back stopped the case in its tracks. The touch DNA recovered from the waistband of JonBenét's long underwear, the underwear she had been wearing when her body was found, produced a male DNA profile, and that profile was consistent with the DNA that had been recovered in 1996. Same unknown male, same individual. A profile that matched no one in the Ramsey family. A profile that matched no one in the FBI's National DNA Database, CODIS. A profile that belonged, without ambiguity, to someone whose identity remained completely unknown. This was not a trace. This was not a fragment. This was a coherent, readable genetic profile from an unidentified individual, found on the clothing of a murdered 6-year-old girl. On July 9th, 2008, 11 and a half years after JonBenét's murder, District Attorney Mary Lacey did something that no official in the history of this case had ever done. She wrote a formal letter to John Ramsey. In that letter, she stated, on behalf of the Boulder District Attorney's Office, that the DNA evidence had conclusively eliminated the Ramsey family as suspects in the murder of JonBenét. She apologized. Not in those exact words. But the letter was as close to an institutional apology as the American justice system tends to produce. It acknowledged, implicitly, that a family had spent over a decade under the weight of public suspicion, media condemnation, and investigative focus that the physical evidence did not support. Patsy Ramsey had been dead for 2 years by the time that letter was written. She never received it. She died in June of 2006, suspected by half the country, mourning her daughter, the formal exoneration arriving 2 years too late to reach her. Take a moment with that. A woman lost her 6-year-old child on Christmas night. She spent the next decade fighting cancer, fighting public hatred, fighting a criminal justice system that had quietly decided she was guilty without ever charging her. She gave hundreds of hours to investigators. She sat for grand jury proceedings. She watched her family dismantled in the press and in the court of public opinion. She begged, publicly and repeatedly, for investigators to look beyond her family. And she died before anyone officially listened. Before we go further, if this story is hitting you the way it's hitting me, drop a comment below. Do you think the DNA will ever be matched to a name? Tell me what you think, and if you haven't already, subscribe, because we're just getting to the part that changes everything. The DNA profile of the unknown male was entered into every available database. CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, which holds the genetic profiles of millions of convicted offenders and criminal suspects, returned no match. Interpol databases were checked. Law enforcement agencies across multiple states were contacted. The profile was shared with investigators in jurisdictions where similar crimes had been committed against young children. Nothing. No match, no name, no face. The unknown male remained unknown. But the science was not finished evolving. In the years that followed the 2008 Touch DNA findings, a new investigative methodology emerged that would fundamentally transform the landscape of cold case investigation across the United States. It was called investigative genetic genealogy, and it worked not by finding a direct match in a criminal database, but by identifying partial matches through consumer ancestry platforms, constructing family trees from those partial matches, and working backward and forward through generations until a suspect profile could be narrowed to a small pool of individuals who could then be tested directly. This was the methodology that identified the Golden State Killer in 2018. It was the methodology that had, by the early 2000s, solved dozens of cold cases that traditional DNA analysis had been unable to crack. In 2023, the Boulder Police Department announced that they had partnered with a forensic genetic genealogy laboratory to apply this methodology to the JonBenét Ramsey case. For the first time in the investigation's history, investigators were not searching for a known suspect. They were searching for a genetic family, building a tree from a DNA profile, working outward from the unknown male's genome through the branches of ancestry until a name, a real, living, traceable name, could potentially emerge. The announcement was careful, measured. Law enforcement was deliberate not to overstate what the process could guarantee or how long it might take. Genetic genealogy is not instantaneous. It requires the right combination of DNA relatives having submitted their profiles to consumer databases, the right family structure, and painstaking manual research to build trees that can take months to complete. But for the first time in nearly 3 decades, for the first time since a little girl was left in a dark room beneath a house full of people who did not know she was there, the investigation had a direction. Not a theory. Not a suspect named in anger by a public that had already decided. Not a profile built from behavioral analysis and circumstantial inference. A direction built from science. From the genetic fingerprint of the person who had been in that wine cellar. The person who had left a trace of themselves on the clothing of a child they had violated and killed and left on a cold stone floor. The person who had walked out of that house while the Christmas lights were still on. His name was not yet known, but for the first time, it was within reach. Here is the part of this story that the true crime industry rarely sits with long enough. There has been no trial, there has been no verdict, there has been no arrest. No one has ever been charged with the murder of JonBenét Patricia Ramsey, not in 1997, not in 2008, not today. 28 years after a 6-year-old girl was found on the floor of a wine cellar 8 steps below her own home, the person who put her there is still, officially, legally, formally, unknown. That is not a cliffhanger. That is not a narrative device. That is the reality that her father has woken up to every single morning for nearly 3 decades. Let's account for what has happened in the years since her death. Because the story of this case did not pause simply because the investigation stalled. Life moved. People suffered. Institutions were forced to reckon, however partially, with what they had done. John and Patsy Ramsey left Boulder in the immediate aftermath of the murder investigation's most intense public phase. They relocated to Atlanta, Georgia, where they had family and where the weight of Boulder's judgment was slightly less suffocating. They remained married. They remained, by the accounts of people who knew them in those years, deeply bonded. Two people held together by shared grief, shared suspicion, and a determination to find their daughter's killer that never fully extinguished itself. In 2000, John and Patsy co-authored a book titled The Death of Innocence, in which they laid out their belief that an intruder had entered their home on Christmas night and murdered their daughter. The book was their attempt to speak directly to a public that had largely condemned them, to present their account, their evidence, and their grief on their own terms, without the mediation of journalists who had already decided what the story was. It was received with predictable polarization. Those who believed in their innocence found it compelling. Those who had convicted them in the court of public opinion found it self-serving. The divide that had opened in the days after JonBenét's murder had, by 2000, become permanent. Burke Ramsey, 9 years old the night his sister was murdered, asleep in his room while investigators moved through the house below him, grew up under the shadow of this case in a way that is almost impossible to fully comprehend. He was, for years, a figure of speculation himself. The tabloid press and various internet investigators had, at various points, floated theories involving Burke that were as unfounded as they were cruel. He stayed largely silent for nearly 2 decades. In 2016, he broke that silence. He gave a series of television interviews and, crucially, he filed a series of defamation lawsuits against media outlets and individuals who had publicly suggested he was responsible for his sister's death. CBS aired a documentary that year which strongly implied Burke's involvement, using forensic experts and behavioral analysts to construct a theory that pointed at him. Burke's legal team called it defamatory. The lawsuit against CBS was settled in 2019 for an undisclosed amount, widely reported to have been substantial. He filed and settled additional suits against other media defendants. Those settlements were not admissions of wrongdoing by Burke Ramsey. And they were not exonerations either. Settlements rarely are. But they were a reminder, if one was needed, that the people damaged by irresponsible speculation in this case were not abstractions. They were real people. A man who had lost his little sister at 9 years old and spent the next 20 years being periodically accused of her murder by people with television platforms and book deals and very little accountability. The grand jury's sealed indictments, voted in October of 1999 but never signed by District Attorney Alex Hunter, were finally made public in 2013, 14 years after the fact. Their release confirmed what had long been rumored. The grand jury had voted to indict both John and Patsy on charges of child abuse resulting in death and of being accessories to a crime after the fact. The specific language of the indictments did not allege that either parent had directly murdered JonBenét. It alleged that one or both had caused or permitted her to be in a situation that led to her death, and had subsequently helped conceal what happened. The release of those indictments reignited the debate that had never truly quieted. For those who believed in the Ramseys' guilt, the grand jury's vote was vindication. Proof that 12 citizens who had examined the evidence for 13 months had reached the same conclusion the public had reached in the first week. For those who believed in an intruder, the indictments were a symptom of the same tunnel vision that had plagued the investigation from its first morning. A grand jury that had been fed a diet of evidence curated by a police department that had already decided where the guilt resided. The truth, inconvenient and unresolved, was that a grand jury vote is not a conviction. It is not proof. It is a determination that sufficient evidence exists to warrant a trial. And District Attorney Hunter, who had access to the full scope of the evidence, including the DNA profile that belonged to nobody in the Ramsey family, had looked at that standard and concluded it could not be met. His successor, Mary Lacey, had looked at the same evidence and formally exonerated the family 6 years later. 2 attorneys, the same case. Opposite conclusions. Patsy Ramsey died on June 24, 2006. Ovarian cancer, The disease she had fought into remission in the years before JonBenét's murder had returned. She was 49 years old. She is buried in Marietta, Georgia, beside her daughter. She was never charged, she was never convicted, and she never knew that 2 years after her death, a district attorney would write a letter formally stating that the DNA evidence had eliminated her family as suspects. She went to her grave as the woman most of America had decided killed her daughter. A verdict delivered not by any court, not by any jury, not by any evidence submitted under oath, but by cable news and tabloid newspapers and the particular cruelty of a public that had decided that a mother's grief looked wrong. John Ramsey has continued to speak about the case in interviews over the years, measured, composed, occasionally raw in the way that grief becomes when it has been carried for long enough that the carrier no longer tries to fully conceal it. He has consistently maintained the family's innocence. He has consistently expressed belief that the DNA will eventually produce a name. He remarried in 2011. He is in his late 70s now, and he is still waiting. Nearly 80 years old, still waiting for his daughter's killer to have a name. Drop a comment. Do you think John Ramsey will live to see an arrest? I genuinely want to know what you think. The Boulder Police Department has changed leadership multiple times since 1996. The case has been reopened, reviewed, and reinvestigated on multiple occasions. In 2023, the department confirmed its partnership with Othram, a forensic genomics laboratory in Texas that specializes in applying advanced DNA sequencing and genetic genealogy techniques to cold case evidence. Othram had, at that point, already contributed to the resolution of dozens of cold cases across the United States, cases where conventional investigation had exhausted itself, and science had been the only remaining path forward. The laboratory extracted and sequenced the DNA profile from JonBenét's clothing. The profile was run against consumer ancestry databases. The genealogical research began. As of the time of this video, no arrest has been made. No name has been officially released. The investigation remains active and ongoing. What exists today is this: a readable genetic profile from an unidentified male, a genealogical investigation that is actively being worked, a Boulder Police Department that has, in recent years, been more transparent about the case's status than at almost any prior point in its history, and a family, diminished, scattered, carrying wounds that time has not closed, that has been waiting for a name for 28 years. JonBenét Ramsey would be 34 years old today. She would have grown up. She would have had a life, perhaps medicine, as she once said she wanted. Perhaps horses. Perhaps something no one could have predicted from the bright, a gap-toothed 6-year-old who charmed every room she entered. Instead, she is frozen at 6. Frozen in pageant photographs and home videos and a case file that has never been closed. Waiting, like her father, for someone to finally say a name. I want to step back from the timeline now. I want to step back from the evidence, from the DNA, from the courtrooms and the grand juries and the cable news panels. I want to look at this case from a distance, the kind of distance that only time allows, and ask what it actually reveals. Not just about who killed JonBenét Ramsey, but about the systems that we're supposed to find out, about the institutions we trust with the most irreversible decisions a society can make, about what happens when those institutions fail, and then spend years refusing to admit they failed. Because this case is not just a murder mystery. It is a case study in how an investigation can collapse under the weight of its own assumptions. Let's start with the Boulder Police Department. In the first hours of December 26, 1996, the responding officers made a series of decisions that were individually understandable and collectively catastrophic. The failure to secure the crime scene, the failure to restrict civilian access, the failure to open that wine cellar door. Each of those decisions, examined in isolation, has a human explanation. Officer French examined the latch and made a reasonable inference. Detective Arndt was managing an impossible situation alone. The officers who allowed friends into the house were responding to the emotional reality of a family in crisis. But reasonable individual decisions can produce unreasonable collective outcomes. And the collective outcome of those first morning decisions was the permanent compromise of a crime scene that could never be restored. evidence that could not be uncontaminated, a body repositioned before it could be documented, a door that should have been the first thing opened and was instead the last. The Boulder Police Department's pivot toward the Ramseys as suspects was rapid and, once made, extraordinarily resistant to revision. This is not an accusation of malice. Tunnel vision in criminal investigation almost never is malicious. It is cognitive. It is the product of a mind, or an institution, that has committed itself to a theory and then begins, unconsciously and systematically, to weight every subsequent piece of evidence in the direction of that theory and discount every piece of evidence that complicates it. The Ramseys lawyered up, interpreted as guilt. The ransom note was long and composed inside the house, interpreted as staged. Patsy's grief appeared theatrical on television, interpreted as performance, and John remained composed in public, interpreted as coldness. Every data point became evidence of the same conclusion, because the conclusion had been reached before the data points were fully examined. This is what investigators call confirmation bias, and in the JonBenét Ramsey case it operated at an institutional level, shaping not just individual decisions but the entire investigative architecture of the case for years. What makes this particularly painful is what was sitting in the evidence all along, the unidentified male DNA present from the beginning, documented, preserved, pointing, silently, patiently, at someone who was not a member of the Ramsey family. That profile did not materialize in 2008. It was there in 1997. It was there in 1999 when the grand jury voted to indict. It was there through every television special that pointed at Patsy, through every tabloid cover, through every conversation in which her guilt was treated as established fact. The DNA was always there. The technology to fully utilize it simply had not caught up. But the decision to pursue the Ramseys so aggressively, for so long, in the presence of that unexplained profile, that decision belongs entirely to human beings making choices, not to the limitations of science. Then there is the media. The coverage of this case was, and I want to be precise here, one of the most irresponsible, sustained episodes in the history of American crime journalism. The pageant photographs, the insinuations about Patsy's parenting, the experts who speculated about guilt on evening programs without any of the evidentiary standards required in an actual courtroom, the unnamed sources inside the investigation who fed the press a version of events shaped entirely by the tunnel vision of the investigators themselves. The media did not report on the investigation of the JonBenét Ramsey case. The media amplified the investigation's biases and broadcast them to tens of millions of people as though they were established facts. And those tens of millions of people formed opinions, strong, lasting, deeply held opinions, based on coverage that was, in substantial part, wrong. Patsy Ramsey spent the last decade of her life as the most publicly suspected woman in America. She was convicted in the court of public opinion with a thoroughness and a confidence that actual courts of law, courts with evidentiary standards and burdens of proof and the presumption of innocence, could never have matched. She was convicted without a trial, without a charge, without a single piece of evidence ever being tested under cross-examination. And then she died. And 2 years later, the DNA said it wasn't her. There are structural lessons here that extend far beyond this one case. The JonBenét Ramsey investigation is a masterclass in what happens when a small city police department with limited homicide experience is handed a case of extraordinary complexity, without the resources, the oversight, or the institutional humility to recognize the limits of its own competence. Boulder PD was not staffed or trained for a case of this magnitude. They needed to call in more experienced investigators from day one. They needed to relinquish the lead to agencies with the capacity to manage it. Instead, institutional pride and jurisdictional protectiveness kept the case in the hands of investigators who were, through no fault of their training, simply not equipped for it. That is a systemic failure. And it is a systemic failure that has been repeated, with variations in cold cases across this country countless times before and since. There is also the question of what this case cost the living. John Ramsey lost his daughter. Then he lost his wife to cancer and public cruelty in roughly equal measure. He spent his professional prime under suspicion, His son grew up as a suspect in his sister's murder despite no credible evidence pointing at him and was forced to spend his adult life filing lawsuits against media organizations that treated his victimization as content. The Whites, Fleet and Priscilla, the Ramseys' closest friends who had hosted them for Christmas dinner the night JonBenét died, eventually became estranged from the Ramseys amid the pressure and paranoia the investigation generated. Friendships dissolved, lives rerouted, a community fractured. A single act of violence against a 6-year-old child radiated outward and damaged everything it touched. And still, at the center of all of it, there is JonBenét. She is the reason any of this matters. Not the theories, not the forensic debates, not the media narratives or the legal arguments or the investigative postmortems. A child was killed in her own home on Christmas night while her family slept above her, and the person responsible has never faced a single consequence for it. That is the fact that sits beneath everything else in this story like a stone at the bottom of still water, cold, unmoved, and permanent. The DNA exists. The genealogical investigation is active. The science has advanced beyond anything available in 1996, beyond anything available in 2008, into territory that has resolved cases far colder and far more evidence-depleted than this one. There is still a real possibility, a genuine, science-supported possibility, that a name will come. But here is the question I cannot stop returning to, the question that sits at the intersection of investigative failure, institutional pride, media irresponsibility, and the particular cruelty of a case that destroyed innocent people on its way to not solving itself. If that wine cellar door had been opened on the morning of December 26, 1996, if Officer Rick French had lifted that latch and stepped inside, would any of this have happened? Would the crime scene have been preserved? Would the evidence have been collected properly? Would an arrest have followed before the trail went cold? Would Patsy Ramsey have spent her final years under suspicion? Would Burke Ramsey have needed to sue a television network? Would JonBenét's killer still be free? One door, one latch, one officer who turned around and walked away. How does an investigation miss something that close? Is it incompetence, tunnel vision, or something worse? And here is the harder question, 28 years later, with a DNA profile that exists and a genealogical investigation that is active, do you believe justice is still coming for JonBenét? Or has the system that failed her once already failed her permanently? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. Thank you for joining us in uncovering stories hidden in the shadows. Every victim deserves to be remembered. Every truth deserves to be told. To follow more cold cases, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share these stories. Your support helps keep their voices alive.